In the brutal shadows of Melbourne's underworld, one name still sends a chill down the spine. Nick Radev. Born in Soviet-era Bulgaria in 1959, Radev went from a Greco-Roman wrestling champion to a hardened criminal. Schooled by the Russian Mafia's dog Operatsiya, a syndicate of nearly 8,000 operatives, 10 times bigger than the American Mafia. He arrived in Australia as a refugee, wiping his record clean, only to rise as Melbourne's most feared enforcer, a man who turned extortion into an art form and fear into power. From Eastern Bloc wrestler to Australian refugee. Let's rewind to 1959, Bulgaria, deep under Soviet rule. That's where Nikolai Minev Radev was born. Life behind the Iron Curtain was tough, and it shaped people in brutal ways. The Soviet system didn't produce soft men, it produced survivors. And Radev was no exception. Before he ever became a feared gangster, he was a champion Greco-Roman wrestler, the kind of sport that isn't about elegance or showmanship, but about dominance. Controlled violence, mental warfare. It teaches you how to break your opponent's will, and that's something Radev mastered early. But Olympic dreams, that wasn't him. Radev had a different fire burning inside. Even in his youth, he found trouble, real trouble. He built up a criminal record in Bulgaria before he was even a man. The details are murky, but what little is known paints a clear picture. He was comfortable with violence and even more comfortable using it. He spent time behind bars, first in Bulgaria, then in Turkey. But those prison years didn't break him, they built him. Each sentence was a training ground, a classroom where he learned the real rules of survival. He didn't just toughen up, he made connections. The kind of connections that change destinies. Behind those walls, Radev came into contact with members of Dog Operatsiya, a Russian organized crime network so massive it made the Italian Mafia look small-time. To put it in perspective, America's Mafia had around 800 made men. Dog Operatsiya, they had nearly 8,000. Their reach went from drug trafficking to weapons smuggling and even political corruption. And soon, Nick Radev became their man in Melbourne. Reinvention, how a criminal got a clean slate. In the early 1980s, Radev did something almost unthinkable. He rewrote his identity. He arrived in Australia posing as a political refugee, claiming he was fleeing persecution from Soviet-controlled Bulgaria. And somehow, through either corruption or extraordinary luck, every trace of his criminal past vanished. Not a single red flag showed up in his records. To this day, no one knows exactly how he pulled it off. But police insiders have long whispered that Russian Mafia influence might have greased the wheels, deciding who got vetted and who slipped right through. And just like that, Australia gave him refugee status, a clean start, a new identity. But Radev wasn't here to start over. He was here to start again. For a while, he played it safe. Almost looked like a regular immigrant. He worked at his in-laws' fish and chip shop in Doveton. Opened a small pizza place in Dandenong. To outsiders, it looked like a man trying to build a new life. But there was one strange detail. Despite running businesses for years, Radev never paid a cent in taxes. Not $1. Even government reports later noted it with confusion. How could someone live like that, yet stay completely under the radar? And then there was his personal life, calculated, deliberate, and unsettling. Radev understood that to stay safe in Australia, he needed roots. A wife, a family, community ties, something that made him look respectable. So he found a way to get it. He set his sights on Sylvia Bruno, a 16-year-old hairdresser. He pursued her, charmed her, and eventually convinced her to marry him. They had a daughter together, and while it might have looked like a happy little family from the outside, behind closed doors, Radev was running a double life. He was a man who could separate his worlds completely. At home, he played the role. A doting father, loving husband, kissing his daughter on the cheek. But what nobody saw was that he was also hiding guns and drugs inside his child's cot. The very place his daughter slept became a stash spot for his criminal empire. Police would later describe him as a drop-in husband and father, someone who showed up just enough to keep up appearances. Before vanishing back into the underworld, Radev wasn't just living two lives, he was mastering both. The business model, extortion as an art form. By the late 1980s, Nick Radev had stopped pretending to be a businessman. The pizza shops and fish and chip stories were long gone. What he built next wasn't a company, it was an empire based entirely on fear. He didn't run drug labs. He didn't smuggle kilos across borders. His business was simpler, more personal, and far more brutal. Extortion. And here's what made it brilliant in a dark way. His victims were other criminals. People with money, connections, and secrets. People who couldn't exactly walk into a police station and file a report. It was the perfect setup. If they went to the cops, they'd expose themselves, so they stayed quiet and paid. Radev's system was cold and methodical. He'd pick his targets carefully. Usually someone smaller than him, someone who'd made money but not enough to fight back. Then came the conversation. The pitch was always the same: protection, a tax for doing business. Maybe $250,000, maybe $50,000. It didn't matter. There was always a price. And if they refused to pay, Radev would show them what refusing looked like, and that's where his terror became real. Because Radev didn't rely on threats, he demonstrated them. Take the case of Sidat Silan, a businessman and fraudster who met Radev in prison in 1998. Inside, Radev played the protector, a friend who had his back. But when Silan got out, he thought their deal was over. It wasn't. Radev invited him to the Stamford Plaza Hotel in Melbourne, said it was for business. But the moment Silan stepped inside, the tone changed. Radev and his men pounced, punching, kicking, holding him against the wall. The beating went on for hours. Silan was trapped in that hotel room for up to 8 hours, beaten, humiliated, and threatened with death. His face was smashed into glass. By the time he left, he was broken, and disturbingly, that wasn't even close to the worst of it. One of the most horrifying cases police ever recorded involved a man who owed Radev money. To make an example of him, Radev sexually assaulted the man in front of his wife and children. It wasn't about sex. It was about domination, control. It was a message that nothing, not even your dignity, not your family, was off limits. He wanted his victims to live in constant fear, to know he could destroy them in ways they couldn't even imagine. That's what made Nick Radev different from every other underworld figure in Melbourne. Most crime bosses scared people with vague threats or the occasional show of force. Radev made his violence personal. He made it psychological. Every beating, every humiliation, it was crafted to leave a scar that never healed. The victims, nobody mourned. For nearly 2 decades, Radev stayed untouchable. And part of the reason was simple. The people he terrorized weren't the kind anyone mourned. They were drug dealers, con men, and low-level crooks, people who lived by the same rules he did. If they got hurt, no one called the police. But eventually, Radev's brutality spilled beyond the criminal world. He went after businessmen, regular citizens, anyone he thought could be exploited. And when he wanted something, he didn't hesitate to take it. One of his most disturbing crimes involved Ivan Solikov, a Russian emigre living near him. At some point, Radev decided that Solikov's identity would be useful. So he killed him. Then, with chilling precision, he took over Solikov's life, opening bank accounts, committing fraud, and using his name for a crime spree. When detectives finally confronted Radev about it, Detective Ben Archbold looked him straight in the eye and said, "We know you killed Solikov." Witnesses say Radev went pale. For once, the man who terrified everyone else looked shaken. But the case collapsed. The key witness, none other than Sidat Silan, fled the country. He defrauded the Australian government of $2.5 million and vanished to Turkey, terrified that if he stayed, Radev would find him. He didn't return to Australia until long after Radev was dead. Then there was the Papadopoulos family, one of the most chilling incidents in his file. In 1998, Radev and 2 associates broke into their home in North Cote. They tied up the parents, gagged them, and then, in front of their terrified eyes, pressed a gun to the head of their 5-year-old daughter. They demanded money. That was Radev's way. He didn't just threaten violence. He brought it into your home, made you watch it happen, made you realize he could reach anyone, anywhere. And you couldn't go to the police because the moment you did, your own secrets would come spilling out. For years, that's how he ruled Melbourne's underworld. Through fear, humiliation, and a kind of violence that felt almost artistic in how precise it was. Nick Radev wasn't just a gangster. He was a predator who understood the human mind and how to break it. The Gary Silk and Rod Miller connection. Now, here's where things start to get really interesting. On the night of August 16, 1998, 2 Victoria police officers, Sergeant Gary Silk and Senior Constable Rodney Miller, were ambushed and gunned down in Moorabbin. They were in the middle of a surveillance operation, keeping an eye on a crew suspected of armed robberies. But that night turned into one of the darkest moments in Victoria police history. 2 officers murdered, not by accident, not in crossfire, but in a calculated attack. It shook the entire state. Because this wasn't just another gangland killing, it was an assault on law enforcement itself. And among the list of people who drew police attention in the aftermath was Nick Radev. Why? Because he fit the profile. He lived not far from the scene. He had a violent record, he had a deep hatred for police, and he had access to serious firepower. On paper, he looked like someone capable of pulling it off. For a while, detectives believed they might have their man. But as the investigation went deeper, new evidence pointed elsewhere. The main suspects turned out to be Bandali Debs and Jason Joseph Roberts, who were eventually charged and convicted of the murders. Though in 2022, Roberts was acquitted after years of appeals. Still, the connection between Radev and the Silk Miller case has never fully gone away. There was never proof, but the fact that police even suspected him of murdering officers says everything about how dangerous he had become. Not many names reached that level. Radev did. The Russian Mafia connection. How Radev became Melbourne's enforcer. This is the part of Nick Radev's story that most people miss, and it's crucial to understanding how he operated. Radev wasn't just a lone thug or a street-level bully. He was plugged into something much bigger, the Russian Mafia, specifically a powerful organization known as Dog Operatia. This wasn't a loose partnership. It was organized, structured, with Radev acting as the Russian mob's point man in Melbourne. His role? Simple but brutal. He was their enforcer, the one who made sure everyone stayed in line. According to police intelligence, Radev's main job was to target drug dealers and other underworld figures. He'd rob them, intimidate them, or shut them down entirely if they threatened the Mafia's interests. He wasn't running drugs himself. He was controlling those who did. Think of him as middle management, enforcing the will of an international syndicate right in the heart of Melbourne. But by the late 1990s and early 2000s, the city's criminal landscape was changing. The old-school players, the Moran family, the remnants of the painters and dockers, were fading. In their place came a new generation, younger, hungrier, and far more ruthless. And at the top of that new wave was Carl Williams, a small-time pill cook who rose to become one of the most powerful crime figures in Australia. His rise shifted the balance of power, and suddenly, Radev wasn't the most feared name in town anymore. Seated in 3, the Sharks smell blood. By 2003, Nick Radev was still active, still operating like he always had. But the world around him had changed, and he hadn't adapted. His enemies were younger, faster, and better connected. Word on the street was that Radev's time was running out. He'd been warned more than once. Friends told him outright that people close to him had turned, that the alliances that once protected him were gone, that there were contracts out on his head. But Radev didn't listen. He thought he was untouchable. After all, he'd spent 2 decades surviving everything: police raids, prison sentences, and assassination attempts. Fear wasn't something he felt anymore. On the afternoon of April 15, 2003, he drove to Queen Street in Coburg to take care of some business. He was behind the wheel of his black Mercedes-Benz CLK 500 convertible, worth over $100,000, dressed head to toe in designer clothes. Versace shirt, $20,000 watch gleaming on his wrist. For a man who'd only held a legitimate job for 8 months in the entire 1980s, Radev was living like a millionaire. He parked, stepped out, and started walking when a red Ford Falcon XR6 Turbo pulled up beside him. The door swung open, and before Radev could react, the gunman opened fire. 7 shots, head and chest. A clean, professional hit. Radev dropped instantly. It was the end of Melbourne's most feared enforcer. 2 of his closest associates, Damien Kosu and Alfonso Traglia, were with him that day. Both claimed they never saw the shooter's face. Both were later listed as persons of interest. But like so many mysteries in Melbourne's gangland wars, the identity of Nick Radev's killer remains unknown. Who pulled the trigger? Victoria police were certain they had figured out who was behind Nick Radev's execution. Their investigation pointed toward a father and son duo involved in large-scale drug manufacturing, both with strong motives to see Radev out of the picture. But the man believed to have actually pulled the trigger was none other than Andrew Benji Veniamin, a career criminal and the trusted hitman for Carl Williams and his criminal empire. So why would Carl Williams want Radev dead? The answer lies deep within the heart of the Melbourne Gangland Wars, a brutal power struggle between the rising New Order and the crumbling Old Guard. Williams was young, ambitious, and hungry for control. Radev, on the other hand, represented everything Williams wanted to erase: the old-school muscle, the independent operator who refused to kneel, and a man with strong ties to the Russian Mafia. And that's where the irony of Radev's death becomes clear. He was taken out using the same kind of violence he had used to build his name. For 2 decades, Radev thrived on fear. He ruled through intimidation, manipulation, and cold-blooded control. But in Melbourne's underworld, power never stays with one man forever. Sooner or later, someone more violent, more unpredictable, and more connected shows up. And when they do, the so-called most dangerous man becomes the next target. The ultimate irony. What makes Radev's death even more haunting is how uncertain it remains. Police were confident Veniamin was the shooter and that Carl Williams ordered the hit, but no court ever proved it. The man who spent 20 years evading justice, terrorizing others, and thriving in chaos eventually became just another name in the long list of Melbourne's unsolved gangland killings. He was buried in a gold-plated coffin, something that, to police, perfectly summed up who he was. A man who never earned a single honest dollar, who contributed nothing to the world except fear and pain, buried in gold like a king of crime. It was a fitting, if pathetic, symbol of the world he lived and died for. What Radev's story really tells us? Nick Radev's story isn't about power or dominance. It's about a particular kind of criminal, the sadistic extortionist who preys on other criminals, knowing they can't go to the police. His empire wasn't built on drugs or territory. It was built on psychology, on fear, manipulation, and calculated violence. Radev's real weapon wasn't a gun, it was his ability to destroy reputations, to make hardened criminals fear him more than the cops. But by the late 1990s and early 2000s, the world around him was changing fast. The Melbourne Gangland Wars, a bloody saga that ran from 1998 to 2010, reshaped the underworld completely. The old-school enforcers like Radev, who relied on intimidation and independence, were pushed aside. In their place rose a new breed, men like Carl Williams and Tony Mockbell, who built empires through money, drugs, and strategy rather than brute fear. In the end, Radev's downfall wasn't just the result of a bullet. It was the result of time, a world that had evolved beyond his kind of violence, leaving him behind as a relic of Melbourne's darkest years. The legacy nobody wanted. Nick Radev left behind a wife and a daughter, but what he really left behind was a shadow that never faded. His daughter grew up in a world where her father hid guns in her baby cot, showing up only when it suited him, pretending to be a family man while living a life built on fear and violence. After his death, the trail of his family goes cold. No one knows what became of them, and maybe that's for the best. In a way, silence is a mercy most victims of organized crime never get. Radev was part of a rare kind of criminal, one that even law enforcement struggled to fight. He wasn't targeting innocent people, he was targeting other criminals, and that's what made him so hard to stop. His victims couldn't go to the police. They had too much to lose. That was his genius and his evil. By preying on predators, he created a world where justice simply couldn't reach him. 2 months after Radev's death, in June 2003, Victoria Police formed Task Force Piranha. Its purpose was to dismantle Melbourne's gangland networks and bring down the people responsible for the chaos. And it did. It took down Carl Williams and exposed the web of organized violence that had been tearing the city apart. Radev didn't live to see that reckoning, but his death played a role in sparking it. It was one of the final moments that forced police to admit how deep the rot had gone. Final thoughts: the untold story. What makes Radev's story untold isn't that it's missing from the record. His name is there in court documents, police reports, and documentaries. What's untold is the human side. The psychology of a man who could play both roles so effortlessly. A father who could smile at his daughter one moment and torture a man the next. Someone who understood fear so deeply that he turned it into a business model, manipulating everyone around him until even his allies began to believe he was too dangerous to keep alive.
The Silk and Miller murders remain unsolved. Radev's own murder has never been proven in court. There are no clear endings here, no justice, no redemption. Just violence feeding on violence. That's the real story of Melbourne's gangland era, chaos that never found closure. Nick Radev died at just 44, a man who contributed nothing to society but fear, buried in a gold-plated coffin as if that made up for the destruction he left behind. His life is a warning, a reminder of the kind of predator who slips through every crack in the system until the underworld itself decides he's gone too far and takes him out.